This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is lake monsters, and I have three experts on the subject. The conversation will begin when we return. The subject is lake monsters, the most famous one, of course, being the Loch Ness Monster, but there are a lot of other supposed lake monsters around the world. I have three people who will be discussing each and every one of them. But before they do, I like to let each of my guests describe and define themselves. So let me start on the left with Michelle Soulier, right? Soulier.
Yes.
She,
Yeah.
she 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 appeared a few months ago on a Bigfoot show. So again, go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you. My most recent book is Bigfoot in Maine, but before that, I wrote Strange Maine, which kind of runs the gamut of all things strange in Maine that have kind of fallen through the cracks of the historic record. So definitely, lake monsters and sea serpents come into that purview. So I'm excited to talk about that.
Now, but before we started here, you had mentioned that you looked up some old stuff about Maine. So Maine has its own lake monster too. What is the name of it? Is it Cham? You know, like Cham, Chessie?
It's It's technically more properly Quebec's lake
Oh,
monster, but it's right up on the Maine border. So it's Ponic,
oh,
and it's in Lake Pahinagamook, which is way, way, way up in the very tip of the state.
oh.
So that's the one that's received the most attention internationally and in the press. Everything else is mostly rumors.
Now, one of the things I know about lake monsters in general, whether it's in Western Canada, they all seem to be in the upper latitudes of the northern hemisphere. They all seem to be in lakes that where glaciers receded thousands of years ago from the last ice age full extent. Is that a similar type of lake that this monster is in?
Yeah, it's another one of the I think it was oligotropic lakes, the very deep, oxygen poor, very much like Loch Ness, purported to have some deep water sea channels that attach it through the St. Lawrence River to the Atlantic Ocean.
Mhm.
So yeah, very similar to some of the lake monster lakes in the world.
Okay. Kelly Hall's on the bottom right. She appeared with Michelle on the Bigfoot show a few months ago. Welcome back, Kelly. If you could give a little bit of background about who you are and your interest in lake monsters.
Well, I studied journalism in college, thought I wanted to write for adults, and did about 1,000 articles before I started freelance writing for kids. Mostly kids 10 and up, so sort of kids and adults sort of crosses over that way. I discovered cryptozoology, mysterious animals, when I wrote a book called Tales of the Cryptids. Looks like this. Thinking I was going to prove they were all fake. Couldn't do it. Discovered that some might be real. I'm not telling you they are real, but there is evidence that certainly supports the belief in some of these creatures. And that's why I came to the sea monsters. I hope to do In Search of Sea Monsters soon. But this is my most recent cryptozoology book.
And you live where out west?
I live in Spokane, Washington,
So
but
that's
I
at that
was
same
born and raised in
latitude.
Texas.
That's at the same basic latitude as all these other ones. Is there a local lake monster up in Washington? You know, in this
We
is
have
it
quite a few. Just about everybody who has a glacial lake says they have a sea monster.
now
A
that
lake
is
monster.
that near the Scablands?
I don't know what the Scablands are. I
Oh,
apologize.
okay.
I know that up towards Canada, but Spokane is only about I don't know 30 miles from the Canadian border. So yeah, it's right in that same vein. But that's not. There are also river monsters that are not in those icy waters.
Yeah, just for those who would listen, the Scablands about 10, 20,000 years ago during the Ice Age, there was a huge ice lake. And then when it started melting, at one point, it's believed that in the period of 24 to 48 hours, the glacier fell and millions or billions of gallons of water rushed across Oregon and Washington, creating what were now the Scablands channels. So that's why they're
Yeah,
called
and I haven't
Scablands.
heard them called that, but yeah, there was that huge glacial flood
Yeah.
that did carry a whole lot of basalt and other rock
Mm.
all the way to the rocky coast of Oregon and Washington State.
Okay. And our final guest is Chitan Noir. She is in the smallest box, but it's not because she's the new person. It's just that she's on a cell phone. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself, Chitan, and your interest in lake monsters, etc.
Sure. So I am the owner of Squatch GQ Publications, which includes Squatch Digest based, and we do more scientific articles and interviews in that on cryptozoology. Watchers Magazine, which is ufology, anything with aliens and outer space. G Hunter Paranormal Journal, which is all paranormal haunted. Dinosauria and Prehistoric Creatures,
Cool.
which is focuses on interviews. Our latest one is on ancient sharks, and I interviewed all the top paleontologists who are associated with different shark species. I also am an author. I have a book called Lake Monsters and Odd Creatures of the Great Lakes, and also one on Mothman and Flying Creatures of the Midwest. I also teach at 2 different community colleges, 2 different courses. One on the paranormal history of the Great Lakes that includes lake monsters, and cryptozoology of North America. Those colleges are Owens Community College in Perrysburg, Ohio, and Kellogg's Community College in Battle Creek and Hastings, Michigan. So I am always either researching or writing or doing presentations or podcasts, with some adventure thrown in here and there because I do love to travel. And one of my things as a travel writer before I took over the magazine business was I will not write about a place that I have not physically been to, because I want to make sure that it meets expectations and that my readers will be safe when they go there.
So let me start with you, Kelly. You had mentioned sea monsters. That's probably a good entry point because probably I would think sea monsters in the Mediterranean or the Indian Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean were around before people started seeing lake monsters or giving them names at least. So when we think of sea monster, we think of the Kraken. I was just looking up this Swedish sea lake monster that they believe were related to sea kelpies. So maybe Kelly, you could tell us a little bit about the background, mythological or otherwise, of sea monsters, and maybe that can lead us into a discussion then of the lake monsters, how they may have evolved mythologically or folklorically or really from it.
Well, I think it's really important to remember in the terms of sea monsters that when they were first mapping out the oceans and when they were first sending seagoing wayfarers out to explore, they were mapping the oceans as they went, and they were not familiar with the animals, with the wildlife that lived beneath the surface of the ocean and often on top of the surface. So they mapped it out, and as they mapped it out, they included the sightings of sea monsters, which often turned out to be whales or similar things. In some cases, they thought it was battling sea monsters, and really, in fact, it was sea monster's male organ that was slapping about at a female whale. So it was more a mating ritual than an actual battle between sea monsters. So that's probably when the popularity started. The other thing is I think a lot of times when people discovered prehistoric fossils, and so I don't know why we're not friends with them. Chilean? I'm sorry, I have your name wrong, because we love all the same things, all the same things. But I think when they just first started to discover fossils, that they sort of assumed that they were current day sea monsters, when in fact they were plesiosaurs or ichthyosaurs, like Mary Anning discovered on the coast of England. So I think you can track it back to the explorers that were creating the first maps of the oceans, and then also to fossil records. That would be my guess as the very beginning of sea monster lore.
Sheetan, do you have any comments on sea monsters?
So when I do research, I think all good cryptozoology research should begin in the fossil record. And for sea monsters, the fossil record is wonderful. When you take into account that the Western Interior Sea, which ran from the Gulf of Mexico up to British Columbia and out through Alaska, was thriving in its depths. You had all manners of ancient sharks, Creatoxyrhina, the Ginsu sharks, Megalodon. You had ichthyosaurs. You had mosasaurs. You had plesiosaurs. These were all, and then you had the interesting little, just starting to develop, fish like all the way from like the little tiny minnows that you can find in almost any rock or fossil shop, all the way up to the Ixthan, which was almost like a barracuda type fish. And then you've got the little tiny trilobites, and you've got sea turtles that are bigger than a Volkswagen Bug, Archelon. And throughout the formation of the Western Interior Sea, at different points in history, those bodies of water actually flowed into the Great Lakes area out through the St. Lawrence Causeway. So you had the possibility for any of these thriving aquatic species to become trapped in the Great Lakes area, Lake Champlain, other big bodies of water that are now landlocked. And so, I always say that, lake monsters are the one unproven, because you can never determine where something is going to be in a body of water if it's free moving. And so, it's kind of like Schrodinger's cat. It could be there, it could not be there, but until we drain the lakes, we'll never know.
Michelle, do you have any comments on sea monsters?
Yeah, it's interesting because my file, which has my lake monster stuff in it, also has the sea monster stuff in it. And at first I was like, well, I'll read that later. And then as I read more and more about the lake monsters, all the theories tie back to the ocean. And so I was like, oh yes, okay, great. So really lake monsters are, except for, the oddball ones like giant beavers and stuff like that, like lake monsters are so related to the original oceanic creatures and species that existed, that it really does all tie in. And any book you read about sea serpents that verges into that will bring that up. I also thought, just as I was looking through everything kind of broadly too, that the interesting thing is that we can accept the existence of sea serpents because we know so little about what is in the oceans, that it's such a wide canvas with so many unknowns in it. It seems more likely, and especially when you have stuff like, the giant squid and all of that finally being documented, it's exciting to think what else we might find. But the lakes are proverbially constrained. They're contained bodies of water, and you'd think it would be easier to find stuff in them. But as Sheetan said, it turns out to be very difficult to track animal life in lakes, especially when they have immense depth or length. You never know where your subject is going to be in it. I'm sure it's extremely frustrating to researchers to have to nail that down. But it's interesting how the psychological approach is that the lake monsters seem less likely simply because they're more limited. But really, even working within that environment, it's still tough to nail everything down.
Sheetan, you wanted to say something?
So, well, what you were just saying with how a free-moving creature can be in any part of the lake. So here's something that I always tell my students when I'm doing my lake monster part of my courses is Lake Erie, which is the most shallowest body of water for our Great Lakes. Maximum depth, probably only 400 feet. But there is a ship, the Bessemer Marquette, number 2. It's about the length of a football field, all metal. It sank in Lake Erie, and they have no record of where it is. So if a steel modern ship, can go missing in a body of water that shallow, then a living, breathing creature that can move around on its own can certainly have every advantage over us.
Let me just pick up on one final point regarding sea monsters, then we'll talk more exclusively about the lake monsters. You probably all are familiar, I think it was in the 1960s, there was a famous photograph in a shallow part, I think off the Great Barrier Reef, of a giant snake-like monster. And you can see it's almost coming straight towards the camera. And this is considered in paranormal circles as some kind of a sea monster. but most sea monsters have been more like the Kraken, more outrageously looking. Whereas when we talk about lake monsters, they seem to either fall in the category of maybe giant snakes, maybe like the giant, what was it, the giant anaconda that died a couple of million years ago down in Venezuela. Yeah, or something that's more reptilian. It, do you think that it's why is there that difference between sea monsters seeming to be more exotic, whereas lake monsters seem to all fall into just either it's a snake or it's a reptilian of some sort?
Well, actually, here in the Great Lakes, I have it broken down into 6 categories that the sea monsters fall into. The first being giant fish, then giant turtles, then sea serpents, then the amalgamations, which are from the Native American legends. And then we have the plesiosaur or prehistoric marine reptiles. And then finally, we do have a merman report, so a fish humanoid type creature. And so in the Great Lakes area, we don't just have sea serpent reports, we have everything. And these go back to all the way to Native Americans who first started, going out on their canoes into the Great Lakes. So there's a lot more diversity there in reports than I think than what you're realizing.
Kelly, any comments?
I don't know. I think I want to believe that these creatures are real. So let me just put that up front because I really want them to be real. Are they? I'm not entirely sure because most of this lake monsters like Loch Ness and Champ and they tend to be described as similar to plesiosaurs.
Plesiosaurs, yes.
Which are reptilian, which means if we had a cold-blooded reptile living in deep water, feeding in deep water, it would have to climb out to sun itself to raise its body temperature in order to convert its food into energy. That's something that's required for reptilian life. They don't have warm-blooded, they can't create their own energy. So if we had a Loch Ness monster or Champ who was reptilian, even if he could survive the cold water, he would have to climb out to digest his food. So even if he ate once a week or once a month, we would still be having multiple sightings. I don't think it can be a reptilian creature. That doesn't mean it can't be another prehistoric animal. There are a lot of prehistoric whales, prehistoric sea lions, pinnipeds. So that doesn't eliminate the possibility of something mysterious being in these bodies of water. But I think we have to eliminate reptilian.
Well, but they have found evidence of plesiosaurs and mosasaurs that were cold water species living in the Arctic and in Alaskan waters. And they have found evidence even up into Iceland and Greenland of these very large, like Liopleurodon, Predator X. They have found the fossil remains. And so it was.
You have to remember that the weather systems changed.
Yeah.
So Alaska was much warmer in the prehistoric times than it is now.
Yeah, there were large millions of years where there wasn't any ice caps when the dinosaurs were. There might have been small ice ages here or there, but basically, I mean, there were dinosaurs in Antarctica, but Antarctica wasn't covered by 5 miles of ice.
Yeah, no, it wasn't. But there is the possibility that there are different species that adapted differently to the circumstances that they were living in.
That's the other thing. You have to consider the possibility of a unique evolution.
Yes.
I'm not entirely sure we've had enough time for a reptile to evolve into being able to create its own heat.
Michelle, your comments, and then we'll move on.
Sure. Yeah, I'd just like to bring up a category of the lake monsters that wasn't on Sheetan's list. I mean, she's working from the Great Lakes area, but in reading books on the topic where they're surveying globally, there's another category which is like the water horse variety, which would purportedly have a mammalian background or ancestry, and so it wouldn't have that same challenge with the cold temperatures. But there are mammals that have skins that are closer to reptile, like not necessarily furred, although some watercourses did have manes from some descriptions, but like whales and stuff like that, where it's a more smooth skin.
Yeah,
So
or
it has a
pinniped seal.
reptilian appearance. It has a reptilian appearance, but it is a mammal. So that's definitely that leaves some room for adaptations there in the
Well,
mammal
yeah.
family.
Well, I mean, I actually did a show a few years ago on the aquatic ape theory of human development. You know, if I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, there was at one point where there's now
Documented.
Kenya, it could have been that human beings the reason that we have less hair and have more blubber and fat than other great apes is because we might have had an aquatic past. Now that's highly disputed, but still, but that's only a few 100,000 years. I think I would tend to agree that it would probably take millions of years for a reptile. But let me just move on to end this first segment. I wanted to talk. Lake Baikal is a lake in Siberia, and it's has holds by volume the most water, the fresh water in the world. I think even something like 10 or 12% of the fresh water on the planet that's not in on glaciers is held in Lake Baikal because it's the deepest. It's not as big as the Caspian Sea, which is technically a lake, nor Lake Superior in terms of surface area, but in terms of amount of water it holds the most. And it's interesting because there is a species of seal that are the Lake Baikal seals that are hundreds of miles from any sea, and they clearly evolved as the ice retreated. So I think that's a plausible theory. But the thing I go back to is the same thing we talked about on the Bigfoot show is if we assume that these are real creatures and they're not supernatural beings, there would have to be a breeding colony. I mean, the seals in Lake Baikal, there are hundreds or thousands of them. They're unique and highly developed. So we're not just talking about, I mean, the Loch Ness monster can't, swim across the Atlantic to Lake Champlain and hook up with the Champlain lake monsters. There have to be monsters in there, and probably dozens of them to avoid inbreeding. So even though, like you had mentioned, Sheetan, about a ship though is metal though, and it's one thing. We're talking we'd have to have a lot of these huge creatures in any of these areas. So let me start with you, Kelly. Is your take about the need for a breeding colony in all of these different lakes?
Well, there would have to be. There would have to be a breeding colony to sustain a species. And while that could evolve into different species through millions of years, um, there couldn't be one Loch Ness monster or one Lake Champlain champ. There have to be many. So that's one of the problems because they've been searching. Say, Loch Ness is 22 miles of area. That's a lot of area. So there could be a lot of creatures. And when they go searching for these creatures, when they do the sonar or whatever they use, whatever particular barrier they're trying to use to capture these creatures, they're forgetting that they're relatively intelligent creatures. I mean, any animal is going to try to evade being captured. It's just instinct. If you go out searching for a bear, you're probably not going to find a bear. And so if you go out searching for a Loch Ness monster, even if there is a breeding colony, they're going to have a propensity to leave unfamiliar sounds and vibrations. It's just not survival savvy. So there could be a breeding colony that just knows how to evade. Also, the tunnels that Michelle was talking about, if they have undersea tunnels access, and there are some theories that there are undersea tunnels in Loch Ness, they might know how to get away from the obvious glare of man searching, causing making a turmoil noise is all they would know. They might know how to escape for a temporary period. That might also be where they breed. That might be also, and a lot of the river monsters, it's the same thing. They're supposedly able to at least temporarily go out to salt water.
Sheetan?
So, two things. One, if they are using sonar, we know because it's been documented that when the Navy was testing sonar units, that they drove populations of dolphins, whales, porpoises to beach themselves and to leave their natural migrating, breeding, and feeding grounds. And to this day, many of these species have not returned because of the sonar that they use. So any species that's aquatic, if it's getting hit with sonar, it's either going to stun it or that creature is going to flee the area and not come back, because it's kind of like in Tremors where they throw the explosives and the worms go racing off in the distance. Sonar does the same thing. It's a hunting method used by large predators, and nobody wants to be, prey to a large predators. Now, another part of that is the migratory pattern. So fish, we know, follow a migratory pattern. Sharks do it, whales do it, salmon do it. Reptiles have a very honed territorial instinct. You cannot just simply pick up a alligator that's being a nuisance and move him 10 miles away, because he will make his way back to what he perceives as his territory. So if we're looking at that for a natural occurring species, then these animals aren't staying in just one place. They are moving. They are finding different areas that have, they're following their food source. They are going back to their breeding grounds. And, the breeding grounds could be different pockets around the world that they swim to. We know that some of the larger species of sharks and some of the larger species of whales travel thousands of miles just to have their babies.
Well, but let me ask you this, Shitan, because we all know about famous salmon runs, and how the bears know what time of the year the salmon are coming to spawn and then die, and they're there by whatever river, and they're feasting. Wouldn't I mean, these animals would probably have predators at some point, and if they're going to spawn and breed at certain places, maybe mankind doesn't know that, but certainly there would be other animals that would want to feast on them, and we'd find the remains. No.
And this is when you have to follow the big predators. Killer whales. Killer whales are known to follow large breeding family pods of the blue whale, of the sperm whale, and if they can take a calf, they will. And the mothers are helpless to save their calves. We also know that the killer whales have no problem taking on the biggest great white they can find, killing it just for its liver. It's been documented and watched. So if there are pockets of these plesiosaurs, mosasaurs, sea monsters, lake monsters out there in the ocean's depths that are swimming around, and we don't, maybe they have a lot of cartilage like the sharks do. When a shark dies, it sinks to the bottom. Anything on the bottom it's a free meal. So if these older plesiosaurs, if these younger plesiosaurs, mosasaurs are swimming along and they are unlucky enough to encounter a pod of killer whales who are apex predators, who know how to hunt everything from the great big manta rays to baby calf whales to dolphins to salmon to great white sharks, that they are up against one of the apex predators, and they are very much on the food chain.
Michelle, any final comment, and we'll take a pause here.
Sure. The breeding population and the lack of visibility of numbers in population. Part of the issue with the lakes, especially the lakes that tend to have the lake monster sightings, the oligotrophic lakes, is they're very, very dark. I was reading an article about a late 1970s diving expedition, just as a preliminary check of the conditions in Pohenagamuk Lake, just to do a better expedition later. And 20, 30 feet down, there was no light. It was pitch black. You had maybe 3 or 4 feet of visibility in front of you, which means you can't see anything around you. So there's extremely low visibility, which allows a lot of leeway for creatures to stay out of your way if they can sense your movement in the water, which we're not sensing from other stuff until it gets right up on us. They might have really honed senses that allow them to just keep out of the way. And the other interesting thing would be if those underwater tunnels and caves are indeed connecting to river and saltwater systems, allowing creatures to traverse them, they might have mating cycles and migratory patterns for the purpose of mating that we don't know about.
Mhm.
I know that I've talked to one marine biologist who has been a lifelong scuba diver, and they saw basically a pod of what could only be described as plesiosaur-like creatures in one of the northern seas when they were diving. So there could be existing populations in the ocean that are still in some form of periodic communication or mating traditions with the lake monsters. We have no idea, but it's an interesting possibility to consider.
Yeah,
Okay.
and migration would definitely limit the number of sightings.
So let us talk about some of the other monsters. We mentioned obviously the most famous one and the one that first hit uh, the public attention was a century or so ago was Loch Ness monster known as Nessie. And it seems that the Essie is what a lot of these creatures are called. Like the Chesapeake Bay monster is called Chessie. We have Lake Tahoe's monster is called Tessie. We have Lake Erie's monster called Bessie. And there's probably a few other Essies out there. So does that mean, just to start with Loch Ness and all the Essies, are all of the Essie monsters, are they all reported to be similar, or is there divergence in these monsters? Sheetan, you look like you're ready to go. Go ahead.
So what I have, what my research has shown is that a lot of the Pressies, Nessies, Bessies, they are referring to a plesiosaur type creature, something with a swan-like neck and a humped back with visible flippers. And but the keys are it has that long neck, but a shorter tail, and the head is more like a football shape, which means it's going to eat fish. Um, so that is generally what we encounter when we're getting reports of a Nessie type creature. And even the swan neck, we don't really think is legitimate because a lot of researchers think, a lot of paleontologists think that their neck movement was more side to side, more serpentine. And the reason they have those long necks is you have this big body. Well, fish can detect that coming. What they don't detect is a similar size, object approaching them. It's very easy for that head to slide in there, grab a couple of fish, swing back out, devour those fish, and they've had their fill. So we don't necessarily see the wild pleurodons, the mosasaurs, in that group, but we do see a definite attribution to plesiosaurs.
Michelle, are all of these Essies more of these reptilian type sorts, or are some of them, like giant otters or something?
I don't think I've ever run across one where it's one of the other types of giant creatures. It seems to be, dinosaur-like or serpent-like, something with a protruding head that comes out of the water and some sort of ability to uh, transport itself through the water using its appendages. So yeah, I think that's pretty safe. I think Cassie, which is the Casco Bay sea monster, was similarly purported to have, humps and a long neck coming out of the water. So yeah, that's right in line with all the rest of them.
Kelly?
Yeah, and I think a lot of the sea monsters, and especially in smaller bodies of water, are the long neck plesiosaur type appearances. That's what's been described. Is what they're describing accurate? That's another question. Because it's like anything else. If you see it quickly, if you don't get a really good look, if you don't make yourself a good eyewitness, then your brain's going to fill in the parts that you didn't actually see well and create a creature that may or may not exist. So it may be somebody. I mean, I grew up watching an old, because I'm very old, an old cartoon called Cecil, the sea serpent. And he had a similar look. And so it may be that, like anything else, that you fill in the gaps that you don't quite understand. Your brain will sort of adapt the visual image that you remember. based on information that you can fill in when you didn't actually see what you saw. The most recent sightings of the Loch Ness Monster, the best picture that I've seen, and it was a remarkable picture, was in, I believe, 220. And it really looks to me like a giant eel.
Hmm.
I mean, it has the same skin pattern, the same, it's just a remarkable image. So it may be that what they think they're seeing isn't what they're actually seeing, or maybe that there's multiple creatures in the same body of water.
Um, in the Congo, there's a creature supposedly called Mokele-mbembe, which is
Yeah.
now that's supposedly a sauropod kind of dinosaur, meaning a
Yeah,
brontosaurus, diplodocus type.
dinosaur.
So if we're talking about these creatures, when we talk about the plesiosaurs and mosasaurs, these weren't dinosaurs. These were sea reptiles, just like pterosaurs weren't dinosaurs.
Marine reptiles.
Right.
They're called
But
marine reptiles.
yeah, but brontosaurs were dinosaurs, and these giant animals. There's debate on whether or not they were endothermic, meaning that they could produce their own heat. Would it be more likely, perhaps, that it could be some kind of actual dinosaur, not a water reptile, that Mokele-mbembe might be a transitional phase between the old sauropods to the Mokele-mbembe swamp monster to these long-necked supposed creatures in lakes.
No,
No.
no, because they are two different evolutionary trees, and it's hard for me to picture a sauropod. I know that the old, especially when I was in grade school, the old pictures showed the brachiosauruses, the apatosauruses in these swamps, and we now know that because of their immense weight, they would have sunk up to their eyeballs if they were in a swamp. They would have sunk under their own weight. So firm, stable ground was a much more desirable living condition. And the fact that these animals were bigger than elephants, and you don't see big mammals like giraffes, elephants, rhinos being, when they had reached their adult size, you don't see them goofing off, so to speak, on where they place their footing, because any trip, any fall, well, they're breaking something. So that applies to the big the big sauropods, the big T-Rexes, all of those. We don't even think T-Rex was a as much of a predatory dinosaur as he was a scavenger, because you don't want to get yourself hurt, because if you get yourself hurt, then you're not eating for a while. If you don't eat for a while, you get weak and then you die. So
I don't know if that's necessarily true of dinosaurs, because Sue, the T-Rex that was found in South Dakota, they also found an adult male and two juveniles in her burial site. And she had a massive break to her leg. And she was able to survive long enough for it to heal, which suggests that the male brought her food. So even though there is a danger of being injured when you play, I don't think that eliminates the possibility of play. Mating is pretty violent sometimes.
Yeah,
Babies play all the time, so I don't think they broke their legs just from playing.
Yeah, no, I'm talking. Think of a 300-pound person, and they would much rather walk on a level pavement than try to walk through a rocky beach, because any little
Sauropods walked on the beaches all the time. There are trackways on beaches, ancient beaches.
that
I don't mean they necessarily went swimming, but
well,
T-Rex certainly didn't go swimming.
no,
So
no, they sang.
so let me turn to you, Michelle. Let's bring in the folkloric aspect of this, because other than plesiosaurs, if we think of classic dragons, whether it's from China over to Europe or wherever there were belief in dragons, dragons could look quite a bit like these sea monsters, except instead of in the air, being in the sea. And I know that Loch Ness monster, supposedly, wasn't there some saint who first recorded it hundreds of years ago? Where he went on a retreat or something, Saint whatever it might have been. So what could some of these creatures be manifestations of an ancient belief in dragons brought to a modern age? When we talked about, I mean, I've talked about UFOs and UFOs. Abductions seem like fairy abductions. Could this just be a manifestation of the culture of today? Instead of believing in dragons in the air, which you're not going to have some 3-ton creature being able to fly, we put them in the ocean instead, or the lakes, Michelle.
I mean, it makes sense that there might be some sort of transition to that. Our vision of mythical creatures changes over the centuries, and adapts seemingly to fit wherever we're at a certain given time. I know that some of the main more metaphysical, esoteric researchers of Loch Ness in the 60s and 70s developed some theories that it did change over time based on what people anticipated seeing. There are some very strange descriptions that came out of different time periods there. I think even one person described what they saw as a giant slug. And I know there are very far afield theories that a couple of these guys had, which I think is discussed in Ted Holliday's Goblin Universe, which implies that whatever is there in the lake is not a fixed monster. It can be whatever it wants to be. So that's going way over on the speculative side. But if we're talking about folklore and people's perception of things and how it fills some sort of need within the human psyche, well, there's room for that.
Yeah,
there's room, certainly.
Two examples of it in folklore or modern mythos. UFO aliens were not always gray and had bug eyes. They were in the 50s and 60s. There was a lot more variety. I mean, still is some variety, but after Betty and Barney Hill, that changed. And chupacabras, in just the 30 or 40 years since they've elevated themselves up in the folkloric realm, they've gone through a number of mutations in the Caribbean to now in the American Southwest. They seem like different creatures when you talk about them. So, Kelly, why don't I start with you? Could what we call lake monsters today be just a manifestation of ancient belief in dragons?
It certainly could be, because, for example, the very first Asian dragons were almost certainly the result of finding fossilized dinosaurs and having no explanation for it, not realizing it's an ancient creature, assuming these must be the bones of a living creature, and it looks like a dragon to me. So I think that's where most original dragon stories came from, is from fossilized remains from prehistoric creatures. So it's absolutely possible. Again, if you don't fully see, don't realize what you've seen in Loch Ness, and you're going to fill in the gaps, you may fill in the gaps of a dinosaur that you've seen before, of something that's been described elsewhere. And you got to remember, Loch Ness didn't start in the 50s and 60s. Loch Ness started with prehistoric people called the Picts, and that was in 300 AD. So they carved them into stone. Some people say that marine creature, the water creature carved in stone, is a dolphin. Possible. But some people say it's Loch Ness Monster. And you're talking about St. Columbo. And he's the one that supposedly in about 565 AD supposedly cast Loch Ness Monster out. She could no longer eat people. And because he had the power of God. Wow.
Sheetan?
So with my research here in the Great Lakes, what I call the amalgamations are what you are calling the sea dragons, the lake dragons. And the Great Lakes tribes all had their own version of a lake monster story. Lake Superior, the big guy up there is the great underwater panther or dragon, or the great underwater lynx. And his name is pronounced Inabishu, but I have found over 50 different pronunciations from different tribes who all had a similar tale about this creature, and they treated him with a lot of respect, because it was said that if you overloaded your canoe with too much meat, too much fur, tobacco, copper, that he would sink your canoe. But we also find other mentioned lake monsters. Carcagna is depicted as a dragon type creature that was black and yellow and had slimy yellow feathers on him. Gassendia was supposed to be a blue and orange meteor dragon that would fly through the air, dive into the water, come back up out of the water. And that one's really interesting because it wasn't just the Native Americans who were reporting them. The French explorer Jacques Cartier actually made mention of this in his journals and was very creeped out by it and was asking the Native Americans, "What is that?" And they were like, "Oh, that's Gassendia." There's also a demon-like lake monster called Onair, and depending on which tribe you are talking with, it's either a wolf-headed type water and air creature that comes out of the mist. And if you see Onair or you hear it screaming, you are to find port. But there's also a dragon version of him that is more air related, but it's when the fog and the mist come that they say Onair comes, and that's when you need to seek shelter. So the Native American tribes of the Great Lakes had various stories of these amalgamations, these creatures that were different pieces and parts. But I want to bring up this one fact. So the description of Inabishu is this larger than a horse type creature that is got a horse's head, a rack of antlers on its head, is usually covered in slimy seaweed-like mane, and explodes up out of the water to attack their ships. So it's well documented that moose can actually dive up to 20 feet underwater to eat the underwater vegetation. And I can play it out in my mind of these Native American men who were told by their shaman, don't go too far out into the lake. Just kind of hug the shoreline because you don't want to tempt fate. You don't want to anger the monster there. And as they're coming around a bend in the water, suddenly this creature explodes up out of the water, and moose are never in a good mood. And the moose is trying to attack their canoe. They paddle for all they're worth, and suddenly they're going back to their tribe saying, "You were correct. This creature is in the water, and it attacked us, and we only had this amount of this and that, so we don't know what we did to anger it. But the next time we go into the water, we're going to leave some tobacco or some copper, and hopefully appease it." So you can see where the roots of the legends have their ties in with natural occurring species, because we know that the moose were walking around when the Native Americans were first starting to come into the Great Lakes area and were setting up their different tribes and settlements.
Well, just since you mentioned Jacques Cartier, the explorer, I just wanted to point out one thing. I know, for example, because I recently wrote a play about the Vikings encountered with the Mi'kmaq people of the St. Lawrence Gulf, and Cartier also went down the St. Lawrence and then up another side river because he had heard a legend of white people with blue eyes being up there, and it was thought that they might have been Viking explorers that never went back to Iceland. But it turned out to, as far as we know, just be a myth. So simply because someone like Jacques Cartier records something doesn't necessarily mean it's fact. I just wanted to get that straight. I do want to talk though about because one of you had mentioned you can't dry up a lake and look for the monster that way. But okay, but we were talking about these lake monsters being in lakes attached to seas. Usually they're deep lakes. Usually they're remnants of glaciers. But I'm thinking of other lakes such as the Great Salt Lake, which is a remnant of Lake Bonneville, which is a much larger part of that inland sea that was mentioned. I'm thinking of the Caspian Sea. I don't know if that's ever had a lake monster, but if one of the great disasters of the 20th century has been the decimation and almost total loss of the Aral Sea. When I was a boy looking at maps, the Aral Sea was, I believe, the fourth largest lake in the world, and now it's 1/150th the size because it's dried up. The toxic chemicals, they diverted, the Soviet Union diverted waters from it. were there ever any lake monsters in these non-glacial bodies of water, like the Aral Sea, the Caspian Sea, the Great Salt Lake, Lake Bonneville, that now that the Aral Sea has dried up, shouldn't we be looking there for some of these creatures' remains? Shitan, let me start with you, and then we'll go around.
So it depends on who gets there first, the scientists or the poachers. Because anytime there is a highly sought commodity in the natural world, anything that comes across it takes it. So with, we see this with whale carcasses. There's some substance that you can collect from whale carcasses that sells for quite a bit of money. So when a whale carcass, washes up on shore, everybody's there to hack into it, take teeth from it, take bones from it, take this oily substance that they can make perfume out of.
Yeah, whale puke.
Yeah, and what's left over for the scientists to actually investigate is a globster, and then it becomes, at that point, it's whatever you can, scientifically describe it as. You do DNA testing on. So if there's no bodies of evidence left, as in carcasses, then no, the scientific community will not find anything because it's been removed, it's been taken.
But well, let me go to Kelly. The thing that Shitan says, I mean, that sounds good to a certain degree, but in practice, it seems a bit impractical that every bit of a breeding colony, let's say, that would be needed if there were creatures, say, in Lake Arlen, and I'm not saying there were, I don't know if there were, would be swept up. I mean, this gets back to what we were talking about with the Bigfoot and the difference between a body and just finding even convincing casts of plaster casts with dermal ridges. I mean, it just seems highly improbable that there couldn't be a single creature found. What is your take, Kelly, on what I mentioned about the Aral Sea and all?
Well, I think a lot of those bodies of water, if they dry up, and it's happening all over the place, we're finding, ancient towns that were once buried under Lake Powell and places like that. I think it would be unlikely that every living thing that was buried in the mud would be gone. I don't think there's anything in the Great Salt Lake because it's far too salty.
Yeah.
And there's almost no life in the Great Salt Lake, but that doesn't, I mean, that's something similar that will happen to all bodies of water. And if you go out looking for dinosaur bones, for example, one of the best places to find dinosaur bones is a place where a river used to run. They're called fluvial sites. And if a group of triceratopses are crossing this raging river and they get washed down the stream and drowned, then their bodies get caught up in a fluvial blockage, like a big tree in the middle of the river. And that's where the paleontologists will find the bones because they've all gathered there. There's a lot gathered there. But anytime there's a sea that dries up, there are lots and lots and lots of fish fossils. So in theory, there could still be fossils found. But I mean, depending on how old the creature was when it died, because if it's just a dead animal, then it won't have had a chance to fossilize yet. Then you've got soft tissue, and then who knows what you're going to find.
Michelle, any comments about finding things if a lake or some body of water dried up if they had some of these creatures?
That would, it's a really exciting idea. I remember reading a kid's story when I was very young about these boys that had this adventure when the ocean had retreated and left the ocean floor open for miles and miles and all the things they hoped to find.
Or go to the Bay of Fundy during low tide.
Yeah, it's like a treasure hunt. But I mean, you have to think about the fact that it happens slowly. The water's receded over time, even though it seems drastic to us looking back at it. It was a progressive occurrence. Populations would necessarily have dwindled and concentrated in the sections of the lake that were still viable as long as they could, and the contest for food would have gotten harder and harder as the resources diminished, and so a lot would have probably been consumed as part of the process. You would think if there was something large, something would be left, but but I don't know. I think there's a lot of competition as an
A lot of
ecosystem.
scavengers.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
humans are
especially
one of
with the RLC, you're in countries that have very closed news systems that don't necessarily share what they find. If the government had gotten involved and handed stuff over to their scientists, we might not know about that. So there's a number of ways that it could play out. It would be nice to think there would be remains, but
But we're
there.
finding new dinosaurs every day. And those are
Mhm.
things that did exist. We just hadn't found them yet. So that doesn't mean just because we haven't found remains of a sea monster or
And
a
it
lake
could, and it
monster
could
doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
and it could
right.
be in the sediment of that lake from centuries before. The predecessors of those creatures are in there in the fossil record somewhere.
Yeah, like
Um,
mammoths, maybe not quite fossilized, but there.
yes. So unless it like cracks apart and we see what's down there, we won't know that part of the history.
And there's also the fact that, so if we do have a limited breeding population, there is a strong potential for inbreeding. And we do know that over a period of time, when there's enough inbreeding going on, the original breeding population will take on a different look, a different um, uh, characteristic to it, because it is not expanding the gene pool. So originally what we were looking at over here, which says, oh yes, this is a plesiosaur, a couple of generations down the line with through inbreeding could look more snake-like because of deformities, different genetic mutations that might run stronger in certain bloodlines than the other. So you might have genetically a very linked species, but from the great great grandparents to the now newest members of the group that are born, they could look a lot different than what the original species did because of inbreeding.
Well, I want to talk about misidentification. I want to. This doesn't isn't specific to lake monsters or sea monsters, but I grew up in the New York City area, and in the Long Island Sound, which is a small body of water between Connecticut and Long Island, there's a little island called Plum Island, and a lot of people believe that there was government research on animals in Plum Island due to radiation, how things reacted, and there are a few famous photos of odd-looking creatures that washed up on shore. But the most famous one is of this pink creature that looks like nothing you would see alive, but they've shown that it was actually a raccoon, devoid of all its hair, having its lower lip chewed off and whatnot. And similarly, we don't know what dinosaurs look like, really. I mean, we are
Those
slowly getting to
puppies
know
don't
some of the skin color. Some had feathers here or there, but we don't know. For example, if you take away the flesh from a lot of living creatures, you wouldn't know what they
elephant.
look like.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You wouldn't know an elephant necessarily had a trunk. So with that being said, and for example, some so-called chupacabras have been shown to be coyotes with mange, and they look quite different. What could be a creature that is misidentified as a lake monster, uh, either living or dead, in a dead state? Let me start with you, Kelly.
I think a lot of scientists think basking sharks, when they decompose, are perceived as sea monsters. I think a lot of
Are
people,
those the ones with the thing that project from the front? Okay.
Yeah.
right. I think a lot of people think sturgeon are
Mm,
actually sea monsters, mini
they're
sea
pretty
monsters,
big.
river specifically, are actually large sturgeon.
Mm.
That's something that's frequently mistaken for a river or lake monster. So yeah, it happens all the time. Like I say, the whales, when they thought two whales were battling, it was actually two whales mating.
Yeah,
I mean, they thought those were sea monsters because they didn't quite understand the anatomy.
yeah.
So I think there's, oops, my bad. I think that happens all the time historically, that you think you saw one thing and actually didn't quite see that.
Sheetan, what kind of a creature do you think could be misidentified as a monster?
So here in the Great Lakes, I would definitely say the sturgeon and the muskies, because those are two of our biggest fish species that are here in the Great Lakes area. Um, Certainly, three of those swimming along together, if they were doing the right formation and swimming, in the right way, that could definitely give the appearance of a sea serpent.
Yeah.
Yes.
Michelle, how about you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, sturgeon are wildly huge. I mean, certainly not 30 feet long, but they create an impressive effect when they're are in the area, and they move the water in ways that you wouldn't think possible in a lake. They do get really really big, or a river too. But it was one of the things I was doing is I read through accounts of Maine lake and sea monsters, was finding what people explain them away as, and it was everything from a family of moose to a family of beaver, uh,
Otter.
otter. Yeah, I was that was almost, yeah, otters, water birds, rotting vegetative matter that is moving because of the gases it's releasing, and the currents, because sometimes there are really strong currents in these really deep lakes.
Driftwood.
Um,
Yeah, driftwood.
so yeah, so there's a lot of interesting little substitute ones that people plug in. Giant newts, that was another one that came up, and then again you come back to more close analogs, such as having a giant seal, like a giant lake-bound seal, or even a giant conger eel, which was one that was proposed in Loch Ness, was that it was a giant conger eel that people were seeing. So there's a lot of potential for
Well,
misidentification. It's never quite explained well enough, though.
well, the sea monster in Lake Champlain, for example, Champ, they did sound analysis of the water, and they found that every sound that they were able to identify was correlated with an existing animal, something they knew was in the water, except for one, and that was sonic.
Yeah, I worked with that last
Sonic
summer.
clicking,
I actually
yeah.
did it. I
So
did an
something is
expedition
in
to
Lake Champlain that we have not identified, and
Yep.
maybe Champ is an evolved prehistoric whale.
It's actually kind of a clicking sound, like
Yeah,
echolocation.
sonar clicking, yeah, like
Yeah.
dolphin.
So let me let's end this with a couple of more questions here. Michelle, let me just ask about. We've talked basically about the classic image of this plesiosaur dragon-like creatures. Of all of these lake monsters that you've looked up, whether in America or around the world, is there a particular outlier lake monster that is clearly not Nessie-like? Is there one, and what tell us a little bit about it.
I would say probably some of the water horses, like if we're talking stuff that's kind of in that lake monster variety, as opposed to like the giant beaver or giant otter
And
or
when you say
something like.
water horses, we're not talking seahorses, the little things that bob up and down. What do you mean by water horse?
They were creatures that were described in a number of different locations around the world as having a very barrel-shaped body, shorter neck instead of a longer neck, and then a cow or horse-like head.
Hmm.
So a different physiognomy without that stretched out silhouette, a much more compact frame. Some cryptozoologists have uh, proposed that might be a gender sex difference in shape and size, morphology of creatures between the male and the female. And so the males are the ones with the long necks, and the females are the shorter, the water horse or sea cow type
Well,
creature.
could they have been like something that evolved from the same stock as hippopotami? Because the name hippopotamus comes from horse.
That's an interesting thought. I mean, there are so, there are so many creatures on this planet, and so many of them have such fascinating physiognomies that it seems like anything is possible.
Because I
Honestly,
think hippopotamus literally means water horse, does it not? The
yeah.
name, yeah.
Yeah.
So Sheetan, what is an outlier lake monster that goes against the dragon Nessie mold?
So you're referencing two different shapes. The dragon being just that, dragon looking. Nessie, we look at more as a plesiosaur type creature.
Okay.
So, and like I said, here in the Great Lakes, we have at least 6 different categories that these creatures fall into that I have I have found. I would
What's your
say,
favorite or the most interesting to you?
okay, so my favorites would be the reports of the giant turtles, like Archelon. There's two different reports: Stearns Bayou monster and Lake Leelanau monster. Both are a giant turtle species that's bigger than a Volkswagen Bug. And then I will always love my Lake Superior underwater panther, Inabishu.
I've
Uh,
got one.
you like that one, Kelly?
Yeah, and I have one for you
Okay,
too.
go ahead. Go ahead.
In British Columbia, there's one called the Thetis Lake Monster. And it's a bipedal, walks on 2 feet, and essentially looks like, gee, this.
Oh,
But the
the
boys
gill
who
man.
spotted it happened to see the creature of the Black Lagoon the night before.
Oh, okay. I was going to say when you said, wow, this wasn't a Christ-like creature walking on water, it was walking in
Walking
water.
on water.
Okay, so let's finally, let me just ask for your final thoughts. And let me start with you, Sheetan, and then I'll go around the horn. I know you weren't around when we did the Bigfoot show, but I'm sure that you probably have some thoughts on that. Along with your final thought, do you think it's more likely that there are lake monsters or bipedals, hairy bipeds?
I think there's the potential for both, but I don't think that the lake monsters that we are looking for are of enormous size. Um, the plesiosaurs went from anything from a 2 foot long creature all the way up to 30 feet long. So I think living in today's world, these are probably smaller creatures that are more adept at living with the environmental changes that they are being exposed to. So I'm guessing that the biggest that you would probably find would probably be about 5 foot.
And do you
If,
have any?
if we were still swimming in the waters.
Yeah. And do you think that's more likely that lake monsters exist or hairy bipeds?
I think they both exist.
Okay.
I with cryptozoology, you have to keep that open mind, and I think there is the potential for all of it to exist because we don't quite know how interdimensions work, how portals work, how the stone record
So
can.
when you mention interdimensional, so you're open to the idea that these aren't just biologically evolved creatures, that these are creatures perhaps from some other existence?
Yes, I think that there is that possibility. Some of them could be alien in nature, but others could just be from a different dimension that we as human beings have not experienced yet or have not come back from that dimension to tell about yet. There's all kinds of different phenomena and irregularities on the earth, and I don't think that we quite understand them yet.
Kelly, final thoughts from you, and do you think that either hairy bipeds or lake monsters are more likely, or?
Oh, I think Bigfoot is far more likely.
Hmm.
I think if we find one, it'll be a Bigfoot-like creature, or in Pendek in Southeast Asia. I think that's far more likely to be found than sea monsters. However, I mean, when they first found an oarfish, I'm quite certain that was a sea monster. And it is a remarkable fish, about 22 feet long. I mean, it takes dozens of people to hold the body of one up when they find one dead in the ocean, which is rare because they're deep water dwellers. So I think there will be lots and lots of unidentified species discovered in the oceans because 80% of the ocean has not yet been explored. We will find many, many new creatures, and we will call them sea monsters if we want to, and we will call them oarfish if we don't. But neither categorization diminishes the value of what we might find. So, do I think they jump from portal to portal, from time span to time span? No, but I'd like them to prove me wrong because I'd sure like to visit the dinosaurs.
Michelle, final word to you. Do any final thoughts? And the biped versus lake monster, which do you give more credence to?
I think that, like Kelly said, I think the unknown primates are a very serious contender for discovery. I think lake monsters are going to remain tricky and elusive if they do exist. But I think, as she said, sea monsters are already out there. We know they're out there, and we just haven't run across them yet. So every time we make some more progress in exploring the ocean floor and its depths, I get really excited because we have no idea. I did a science fair project on that when I was a kid, and I've been excited about it ever since. So so I think the ocean is full of things which we would consider monsters out of context, but they're just another amazing creature on the planet.
Well, below this
Wait,
video, I'll
uh,
link to each of your websites. Thank you for speaking about it, all three of you, and have a good night.
Thanks for having us.
Dan,
Bye.
meet you
Yeah.
guys.